A sick dog, tied to a tree in the wilderness, watches in fear as lions creep closer. Their roars echo, ready to strike, but suddenly, something so incredible happens that the lions themselves cry out and run away. The dog, once full of life and energy, now stood trembling and broken. Its once shiny coat was now dull and matted, clinging to a body so thin its ribs were clearly visible. Once bright eyes, filled with curiosity and joy, now reflected only pain and hopelessness. Every shallow breath the dog took seemed like a struggle, as if life itself was slipping away. It had been left alone, abandoned by the one person it had trusted most. The rope around its neck was tight, cutting into its skin, tethering it to a tree in the middle of a cold and unforgiving wilderness. Nearby stood the man. His face was hard, worn down by years of struggles and disappointments. His cold eyes held no trace of compassion as he looked at the dog, now just a burden to him. Life had been cruel to him, debts were piling up, his dreams slipping further out of reach. His heart, once perhaps capable of kindness, had grown cold with time. In his mind, the dog wasn't worth the effort anymore. He pulled the rope tightly around the tree, securing the dog in place, and stepped back. The cries of the dog didn't move him. Instead, he turned and walked away, the sound of his boots crunching on the frosted ground fading into the silence. He didn't look back. The distant roars of lions echoed in the air, signaling the danger that was closing in. The dog lowered its head, its body trembling in fear and exhaustion. There was no fight left, no one left to save it. Alone, abandoned, and surrounded by the growing darkness, the dog could only wait for the inevitable. The dog, tied to the tree, barely had the strength to lift its head. Its body was frail, trembling violently against the cold. Each breath it took was labored, its sides rising and falling unevenly. Exhaustion had taken over, and its legs quivered beneath it, struggling to keep it upright. The once vibrant creature, now battered and weak, seemed to accept its grim fate. There was no escape. The rope around its neck was tight, biting into its skin, and its energy was long gone. The roars grew louder, cutting through the stillness like a knife. The dog's ears twitched, its nostrils flaring as the scent of predators began to fill the air. Fear took hold, but the dog didn't cry out. It had no strength left to fight, no will left to resist. Its head hung low, and its eyes, now dull and lifeless, stared into the darkness as if waiting for the inevitable. Then, faint movements began to stir in the distance. Shadows, low to the ground and sleek in shape, appeared between the trees. The lions were coming closer, their movements silent but purposeful. Their glowing eyes pierced through the darkness like lanterns, reflecting their predatory intent. The dog's body stiffened, its breathing quickening as instinctive fear coursed through it. But even then, it didn't bark or whimper. It knew no one was coming to save it. The lions crept forward, their large bodies blending seamlessly into the night. Their paws made no sound as they moved, their eyes locked on the defenseless dog tied to the tree. One lion emerged first, its golden coat glinting faintly under the sliver of moonlight. It paused, crouching low to the ground, its muscles tense as it prepared to pounce. Behind it, more lions followed, forming a loose circle around the tree, their growls low and menacing. The dog let out a soft whimper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Its weak legs gave out, and it collapsed onto the cold ground, unable to stand any longer. The lions edged closer, their growls growing louder, their teeth glinting in the faint light. The leader of the pack stepped forward, its sharp claws sinking into the dirt as it locked eyes on its prey. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, every second dragging on as the lions inched closer. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness. The dog lay motionless, its body too weak to resist, its fate seemingly sealed. The leader of the lions crouched lower, ready to strike, its golden eyes focused intently on the trembling dog. But then, just as the predator prepared to lunge, a piercing sound shattered the silence. A sharp, high-pitched whistle echoed through the night, startling the lions. They froze in their tracks, their ears swiveling toward the unexpected noise. The dog's ears twitched as well, its glassy eyes flickering with faint curiosity. The whistle came again, louder this time, followed by the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. The lions, wary and confused, hesitated, their glowing eyes darting toward the source of the sound. For a moment, the wilderness held its breath, as if waiting to see what would happen next. The leader of the lions stepped back slightly, its growls softening, unsure of the new threat. Out of the shadows, a flickering light appeared, bouncing faintly through the trees. It was a lantern, carried by a figure emerging from the darkness. The lions growled in warning, but they didn't advance. Something about the figure caused them to pause, their predatory confidence wavering. The dog, still collapsed on the ground, raised its head weakly, its eyes now locked on the approaching light. In that moment, the fate of the dog seemed to shift, the impossible now within reach. The shadows of the lions lingered, but so too did the hope carried by the mysterious figure stepping into the clearing. Just as the lions crouched low, ready to strike, a sharp whistle pierced through the silence. The sound was startling, unnatural in the stillness of the wilderness. The lions froze, their ears flicking toward the source. Their glowing eyes darted through the darkness, momentarily distracted from the defenseless dog lying at the base of the tree. The whistle came again, sharper this time, followed by the crunch of footsteps on the frozen ground. From the shadows emerged a figure carrying a flickering lantern. The warm glow of the light cut through the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows. The lions growled low, their focus now shifting to this new presence. They didn't retreat, but they hesitated, their movements cautious. The figure moved closer, revealing an older man, his face weathered and rough, yet determined. His clothes were simple and worn, marked by years of living off the land. He wasn't armed with a weapon, only the lantern and a strong will. His sharp eyes swept over the scene, quickly taking in the dog tied to the tree and the hungry predators circling it. "Get out of here," he barked, his voice steady and commanding. He swung the lantern in a wide arc, the flames inside flaring brighter. The sudden motion and light made the lions flinch. They growled louder, their teeth bared, but they didn't advance. The man stepped forward boldly, making himself appear larger. He whistled again, sharp and piercing, the sound bouncing off the trees and startling the lions further. One of the lions, braver than the rest, took a cautious step forward, its golden eyes locked on the man. Undeterred, the man stomped his foot hard on the ground and swung the lantern again, this time shouting, "Go! Get out of here!" The lions snarled, their growls rumbling like thunder, but their instincts were stronger than their hunger. The man's unwavering courage and the unpredictable movement of the lantern confused them. One by one, they began to back away, retreating into the shadows from where they had come. The leader of the pack lingered a moment longer, its glowing eyes locked with the man's, before letting out a frustrated growl and disappearing into the darkness. As the last of the lions vanished, the man stood still, holding the lantern high. He listened intently, waiting to ensure the danger had truly passed. Only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant howls of the retreating predators remained. The man turned his attention to the dog, who lay motionless on the ground, too weak to even lift its head. His stern expression softened as he approached, his boots crunching softly on the frozen earth. He crouched down beside the trembling animal, his weathered hands gently touching the rope that bound the dog to the tree. "Who would do this to you?" he muttered, his voice filled with both anger and sorrow. He pulled out a small knife from his pocket and carefully cut the rope. The dog whimpered softly, flinching at first, but it didn't resist. The man worked quickly, freeing the animal and wrapping his coat around its frail body to keep it warm. "It's all right now," he said softly, his voice steady but kind. "You're safe." The dog's glassy eyes slowly shifted to meet his, as if searching for reassurance. In that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile trust, born from desperation and kindness. The man stood, cradling the dog in his arms. Though it was weak and barely responsive, it didn't struggle. The warmth of his coat and the steady rhythm of his movement seemed to bring the dog some comfort. "We'll get you out of here," he whispered, as he began walking away from the tree and into the night. The lantern's light flickered gently, illuminating their path through the wilderness. Behind them, the shadows of the lions had vanished, replaced by the faint promise of hope. The man stepped closer to the trembling dog, his lantern casting a soft glow over the scene. He paused a few feet away, taking in the pitiful sight before him. The dog was lying on its side, barely able to move. Its chest heaved with shallow breaths, and its dull, matted fur clung to its frail frame. The rope around its neck dug into its skin, a cruel reminder of its abandonment. Kneeling slowly, the man spoke in a calm, gentle voice. "Easy now, boy. I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, his rough hands reaching for the rope. The dog flinched at the touch, a weak whimper escaping its throat. Its body tensed, but it didn't have the strength to pull away. The man's heart ached at the sight of the animal's fear, mixed with its utter exhaustion. Using a small knife from his pocket, he carefully cut the rope, freeing the dog from its cruel tether. The rope fell away, and the dog's head sank lower as if it couldn't even hold itself up anymore. "There you go," the man said softly, his voice carrying a tenderness that had long been buried under years of solitude. "You're free now." He reached into his bag and pulled out a canteen of water. Unscrewing the cap, he tipped it gently toward the dog's mouth. "Here, drink," he urged, his voice soothing. The dog hesitated for a moment, its cloudy eyes flicking toward the man, then to the water. It sniffed weakly before its tongue flicked out to lap at the liquid. The man tilted the canteen just enough to let the water flow slowly, careful not to overwhelm the fragile creature. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said, more to himself than the dog. Once the dog had taken a few sips, the man reached back into his bag and pulled out a small piece of bread he had saved from his last meal. He broke it into smaller pieces and held one out to the dog. At first, the dog didn't react, its body too weak to care. But after a moment, it stretched its neck just slightly and took the bread from his hand. The man smiled faintly, watching as the dog chewed slowly, as though it were rediscovering the taste of food. The man sat beside the dog, giving it space to adjust to his presence. He could see the weariness in the animal's eyes, the silent pain of betrayal and neglect. He didn't rush it, knowing trust couldn't be forced. Instead, he kept his movements slow and deliberate, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe now," he said, leaning back against the tree. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." The dog lifted its head slightly, its gaze meeting his. For a brief moment, its dull eyes seemed to soften, as if it understood his words. It wasn't much, just a faint flicker of trust, but it was enough. The man felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the dog settle back down, its body curling slightly against the cold ground. Reaching for his coat, the man draped it gently over the dog's thin frame, shielding it from the biting wind. The dog didn't resist. Instead, it let out a faint sigh, its body relaxing for the first time in what must have been days. The man rested a hand lightly on its side, feeling the faint rise and fall of its breaths. In the stillness of the night, surrounded by the endless wilderness, a bond began to form. It wasn't spoken, nor could it be fully understood, but it was there, a fragile connection between a man who had seen his share of pain and a dog that had endured more than it ever should. For the first time, the dog wasn't alone. And for the man, whose life had been filled with solitude, this moment reminded him that even in the harshest circumstances, compassion could spark something extraordinary. The man stepped forward slowly, his lantern casting a soft glow on the trembling dog tied to the tree. His footsteps were careful, and his voice low as he whispered, "It's okay, boy. I won't hurt you." The dog flinched at his approach, its frail body tensing, though it barely had the strength to move. Its matted fur clung to its thin frame, and the rope around its neck had left deep marks on its skin. Kneeling down just a few feet away, the man paused, taking in the heartbreaking sight before him. The dog's shallow breaths were labored, and its cloudy eyes seemed to plead for help while reflecting fear at the same time. His chest tightened at the sight, but he knew he had to be careful not to startle the already terrified creature. With slow, deliberate movements, the man reached for the rope. "Easy now," he said gently, his rough hands working to free the dog. The animal flinched again but didn't resist as he cut through the tight bindings with a small knife. The rope fell to the ground, and the dog's head drooped further, as if even holding it up was too much to bear. "There you go," the man said softly, pulling a small canteen of water from his pack. He unscrewed the lid and tipped it slightly toward the dog's mouth. "You need this, don't you?" The dog hesitated, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of water. Slowly, it stretched its neck and began to lap at the liquid, its tongue moving weakly but gratefully. The man tilted the canteen carefully, letting the dog drink at its own pace. After a few sips, the man reached into his bag and pulled out a piece of bread. He broke it into small chunks and placed one in the palm of his hand, extending it toward the dog. "Here," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's not much, but it'll help." The dog sniffed cautiously before taking the bread, chewing it slowly as if rediscovering the taste of food. The man watched quietly, his heart heavy yet hopeful. The dog didn't pull away from him now, its trembling body seeming to relax just slightly. He placed another piece of bread down on the ground, giving the animal space to eat without feeling pressured. "That's it," he murmured. "You're doing good." As the minutes passed, the man stayed by the dog's side, letting it adjust to his presence. He draped his coat over its frail frame, shielding it from the cold wind that swept through the wilderness. The dog didn't resist. Instead, it let out a soft, almost relieved sigh and laid its head down on the ground. The man gently placed a hand on the dog's side, feeling the faint rise and fall of its breathing. "You've been through so much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you're safe now. I promise." For the first time, the dog lifted its head just slightly and looked at him. Its cloudy eyes held a flicker of something new, trust. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the vast, empty wilderness, a bond began to form. It was fragile and unspoken, but it was there, a small spark of hope for both the dog and the man who had found it. The man carried the fragile dog through the dense wilderness, the lantern's faint light guiding his way. The dog lay limp in his arms, too weak to move, but its faint breaths gave him hope. He whispered softly, "Just hold on, boy. We're almost there." The freezing wind bit at his face, but he pressed on, determined to reach his cabin. After what felt like hours, he arrived at a small, weathered cabin tucked away in the heart of the forest. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the faint glow of firelight spilled through the window. Pushing the door open, the man stepped inside and gently placed the dog on a bed of hay near the fire. "This is your place now," he murmured, pulling off his coat and draping it over the shivering animal. The cabin was simple but warm. The man moved quickly, lighting a few candles and gathering supplies. He heated water over the fire and crushed dried herbs he had collected from the forest earlier. Mixing them into the water, he created a soothing remedy. Kneeling beside the dog, he dipped a cloth into the mixture and began cleaning its wounds. The dog flinched slightly but didn't resist. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "I know it hurts, but this will help." He worked carefully, cleaning every cut and scrape with gentle hands. The dog's breathing slowed, and for the first time, its body seemed to relax under his care. Over the next few days, the man devoted himself to nursing the dog back to health. He cooked simple meals, feeding the animal small portions to rebuild its strength. At first, the dog hesitated, unsure of the man's intentions. But hunger eventually won, and it began to accept the food, its movements slow and deliberate. Each morning, the man would brew herbal teas and carefully drop the warm liquid into the dog's mouth using a spoon. "You're stronger than you think," he would say, his voice filled with quiet encouragement. Slowly, the dog's dull coat began to regain a faint shine. Its breathing grew steadier, and its eyes, once lifeless, started to show hints of curiosity. The bond between them grew with each passing day. The dog would watch the man move around the cabin, its gaze following him as if it was beginning to trust him. On one particular morning, the dog managed to lift its head fully, its ears perking up as the man approached with food. "That's it," he said with a smile. "You're getting there." A week later, the dog took its first unsteady steps. Its legs wobbled, but it pushed forward, determined to stand. The man knelt beside it, a proud smile on his face. "You've got it, boy," he said, patting its side gently. Day by day, the dog's strength returned. It began exploring the small cabin, its movements more confident. The man watched with quiet pride, knowing he had not only saved the dog's life but also found a companion in the process. What was once a fragile, broken animal now stood as a symbol of resilience, ready to face the world again. The days passed peacefully in the cabin, with the dog steadily regaining its strength. It followed the man closely now, watching his every move, as though it had finally found someone it could trust. The bond between them grew stronger with each shared meal, each quiet moment by the fire. The dog no longer flinched at his touch, leaning into his hand when he reached out to scratch behind its ears. But the wilderness was rarely quiet for long. One morning, as the man was chopping firewood outside, the dog's ears perked up sharply. Its body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. The man immediately paused, following the dog's gaze toward the edge of the tree line. He couldn't see anything, but years of living in the wild had taught him to trust an animal's instincts. Setting down the axe, he grabbed his rifle from inside the cabin and scanned the area carefully. The forest seemed still, but something felt off. There were faint tracks near the edge of the clearing, hoofprints and boot marks in the dirt. They weren't his, and they hadn't been there the day before. Someone had been nearby. His jaw tightened as he looked at the dog. "We might have trouble, boy," he muttered. The dog whined softly, pressing closer to him. That evening, the man stayed awake longer than usual, keeping watch from the cabin window. The dog lay at his feet, its ears twitching at every sound outside. The crackle of the fire seemed louder in the tense silence. He thought about who could have left those tracks. Were they hunters? Or worse, was someone looking for the dog? The next morning, the dog's behavior confirmed his fears. As the man walked with the dog near the stream, it suddenly froze, its nose twitching in the air. It growled, low and threatening, staring ahead as if it had caught a scent it recognized, and feared. The man scanned the area and spotted fresh tracks in the mud along the streambed. Boot prints. They were deep and deliberate, leading toward the cabin. Whoever it was, they were looking for something, or someone. The man knelt beside the dog, resting a hand on its head. "Looks like your past might have caught up with you," he said quietly. The dog whimpered, its body trembling slightly, but it didn't back away. Instead, it pressed closer to him, as if seeking protection. The man stood, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We won't let them take you," he said firmly. He spent the rest of the day preparing. He reinforced the cabin doors, checked the traps he'd set around the clearing, and kept his rifle loaded and within reach. The dog stayed by his side the entire time, its eyes following his every move. That night, the first signs of trouble appeared. A faint rustling came from the forest, too loud to be the wind. The dog growled again, standing stiffly at the door. The man grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, lantern in hand. He could just make out the shapes of two figures near the edge of the clearing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. The figures didn't respond. One of them stepped forward slightly, and in the dim lantern light, the man caught a glimpse of a rifle slung over their shoulder. "We're here for the dog," the stranger said coldly. "It's ours." The man's grip on his rifle tightened. "You left it to die," he said. "It doesn't belong to you anymore." The standoff stretched into a tense silence. The dog stood at the man's side, growling low and steady. Finally, the strangers stepped back into the shadows. "We'll be back," one of them warned before disappearing into the forest. The man knelt beside the dog, running a hand through its fur. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We'll face them together." The dog licked his hand, its trembling replaced by trust and determination. Together, they would protect the life they had built, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound sharper. The man sat by the fire, his rifle resting within arm's reach. The dog lay at his feet, its ears flicking at every faint noise from the forest. Both of them knew trouble was coming, it was only a matter of when. Suddenly, the dog's head shot up, a deep growl rumbling in its throat. The man stood quickly, grabbing his rifle as he moved to the window. In the dim moonlight, he saw shadows shifting at the edge of the tree line. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. "They're here," he muttered, glancing down at the dog. "Stay close, boy." Moments later, 3 men emerged from the trees, their figures illuminated by the faint glow of a lantern one of them carried. They were armed, their faces hard with determination. The leader, the same man who had come before, stepped forward. "We told you we'd be back," he called out, his voice cold. "Hand over the dog, and no one gets hurt." The man stepped out of the cabin, his rifle raised. The dog stood beside him, its once weak frame now strong and steady. Its growl grew louder, a clear warning. "This dog doesn't belong to you," the man said firmly. "You left him to die. He's with me now." The leader sneered. "That's not your choice to make." He signaled to the others, who began to spread out, trying to flank the man and the dog. The man tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes sharp as he tracked their movements. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, his voice steady, "but I will if I have to." One of the attackers lunged forward with a rope, aiming to grab the dog. But the dog was ready. It leaped forward, teeth bared, and snapped at the man's arm. The attacker cried out, dropping the rope and stumbling back. The dog didn't back down, standing tall and growling fiercely. Another man raised his rifle, aiming at the dog, but the wanderer fired a warning shot into the air. "Enough," he shouted. "If you want to leave here alive, you'll turn around now." His voice carried the weight of someone who meant every word. The leader hesitated, his confidence faltering as he looked at the dog, now standing protectively in front of the man. The animal's strength and determination were undeniable, its fierce loyalty clear. "It's not worth it," one of the men muttered, backing away. The leader cursed under his breath, but he knew they'd lost. "This isn't over," he growled before retreating into the forest with the others. The man lowered his rifle, watching until the shadows disappeared completely. He knelt beside the dog, placing a hand on its head. "You did good, boy," he said, his voice filled with pride. The dog leaned into his touch, its tail wagging slightly. Together, they walked back to the cabin, their bond stronger than ever. For the first time, the wilderness felt truly peaceful. In a world that often feels harsh and unforgiving, this story reminds us of the incredible power of kindness and courage. When cruelty and despair seem to take over, it only takes one act of compassion to change everything. This is more than just a story about survival, it's about the bond that can form between humans and animals, a bond built on trust, love, and understanding. The dog, left to die in the wilderness, was given a second chance by a man who chose to act out of kindness instead of indifference. That simple choice to save a life led to something extraordinary. Together, they faced challenges, overcame fears, and built an unbreakable connection. The dog, once weak and abandoned, grew strong and determined because someone believed it deserved to live. And in helping the dog, the man found hope and companionship in a way he never expected. This story is a powerful reminder that no act of kindness is too small. Whether it's helping an animal in need, standing up for what's right, or offering support to someone struggling, these actions ripple out in ways we can't always see. The courage to protect and the compassion to care can create a better world, not just for ourselves but for every living being. As the dog found strength and trust again, so did the man. They showed us that even in the darkest moments, we can find light by standing together. The bond they shared wasn't just about survival, it was about showing that love and kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to take its message forward. Share it with someone who could use a little hope today. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of resilience, compassion, and the incredible connections we share with animals, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Together, we can spread a message of hope and kindness, inspiring others to take a stand for those who can't speak for themselves. Let's make sure no life is ever forgotten, no matter how small or helpless it may seem. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes, a little courage and a lot of compassion can change the world.